We are joined today by Stephanie Dinkins, Kusama Endowed Chair in the Art Department at Stony Brook University. And we're going to be talking about the intersection of art, AI, and what it means to be an innovator as an artist in 2024 and going forward. Stephanie, we were discussing something a moment ago that caught my attention. We were talking a little bit about your background with technology, when you formed this affinity or this relationship with technological apparatus, when that became part of your life. And you mentioned that as a child, it came in the form of CB radio, and that you would have long conversations with truckers, people you didn't know, strangers. And I asked if the goal was to have conversations or to listen. And then we started talking about how an artist wants to be heard. That one of the goals of an artist is to be heard. And I was just wondering, at this point in your life and career, do you feel, in a broad sense, heard?
Well, interesting question. Thank you for having me, first of all.
Yeah, thanks.
Do I feel heard? That's a great question, right? Yeah, okay. So maybe I'll put it this way. In one way, I feel very heard, right? Like, I think I am putting ideas into the world, and I will say ideas, not art, right? The art carries the ideas, but it's the ideas that are important to me into the world that are reverberating, and I can feel them coming back to me and at me in different ways. So in that sense, the work that I'm making is being picked up by others. Hopefully they are running in their own direction and doing other things with some of the ideas, and actually coming back at me. So then I have to think about what it means to have work that you've done kind of bounce back off the wall, and whether it's a good effort or not, or doing the work that I hope it does beyond myself. So yeah, in one sense I feel very heard, right? And then there are other senses where it's like, oh, I don't know, I equivocate about that, right? Because it's like the moment of being heard in one way, and then the desire to maybe be able to be more elemental in the ideas that I'm thinking about, not have to package them in particular ways so that they are received well. Yeah, I think that's it. It's like this very strange place, but I can't complain. I'm gonna say, yeah, I'm being heard right now.
You mentioned putting your work out into the world and then it almost having a life of its own. And this makes me think of something akin to like an algorithmic system or an artificial intelligence, to where it is designed, it is built, but then has a life of its own. Do you see your work as, are you consciously attempting to create systems, or is that a false equivalence there?
I think it's slightly false, right? Okay. I mean, I think I'm consciously trying to explore systems, right? And then that means through the exploration, I create a kind of system, but the aim isn't necessarily to create the system.
Right.
It's more about the exploration, what can be learned from playing in it, picking it apart, putting it back together, changing the way things work within it. So I always think that I'm creating models of something, like I'm modeling, not creating whole systems, right? And then the hope is that if you model something, that as I said before, others will pick it up and see what that model might be able to do in a different direction. Maybe they will reject or have to at least grapple with that model, right? And trying to push towards, something different. Like, I'm always thinking there's a possibility for something different. But we're so entrenched in these ways that we create things and the systems that create them. So what do you need to do to interrupt that system in a way that it can see that there's another way and that it actually wants to pursue it?
And your work does deal so heavily with systems. So I think before we go further, could you help me understand the difference between, like, let's say something as elementary as a model and a system? Where does the model differ from the system?
That's great. I'm like, could I? I'm not sure that I can, right? It's an interesting thing, right? For me, okay, let's think about this for a second. A model, right? And let's say I'm talking about a model being making something or behaving in a way that shows that something can be done, right? It might use systemic elements, but it's like an outlier in some ways, right? Or it could be an inlier, it could be an in-house model, right? And a system would be the thing that holds that or holds the status quo in a certain way. So I think they actually act in similar ways, right? So if we take something like maybe an algorithm and they both have aims, and one is trying to break the mold of what that system is trying to do so that maybe it handles information differently than what is the automatic response to systems or what is the educated response to the way that the algorithm should function. Like, I feel like that system has a life of its own that is contained in a very specific kind of box. Whereas the model could be contained within the box, or could be outside, could be knocking at the door of the system, right? So am I making any sense?
Yeah, a model could suggest a multitude of systems.
Exactly.
Or is the end goal always a system? Can a model suggest something else?
I think a model could really suggest something else, but that's a lot of burden on a model, right? Because we live in a world of systems in many ways, right? And so it's like, well, I'm always thinking about how you navigate the systems that you're in, but you don't want to get mired in that and just held in place by what that system does. So then the question becomes, well, what's the jailbreak, right? Like, what are the changes that you make to step out of that or to change that system to some extent? It might be tiny changes, right? I'm usually talking about like small protopian changes to a system, not gigantic systemic changes, not revolution in a way, right? But like this way of surviving the space, the system that one's in, and then hopefully not only being satisfied with the idea of survival, but thrival, right? How do you thrive in a system that is sometimes very adversarial to who and what you are, what you're supposed to be doing, or what it is thought that you're supposed to be doing?
Has there been a project, either past, present, or in the works, that you feel comes closest to achieving that goal for you?
Oh, nice questions. You know, that's a hard one. Like, I think they do different things, right? So let's say achieving that goal. I want to say conversations with Bina 48 in a way, because it's a project in which I really think I just made a meme. I made an image that hit a nerve in a way that made people have to stop and like quizzically think and consider. And that to me is powerful, and it has been powerful for people because it's opened a door for people to be able to consider things that, from what they tell me, they were afraid to even think about, right? And you're like, oh, cool, right? Now at least you're thinking about this, right? I also think Not the Only One does this, right?
Yeah.
So Not the Only One is a chatbot I made, which is memoir, well, supposed to be, it started out as the idea of a memoir of my family. Started out in 2018. It's a horrible chatbot. In some ways, it's a super failure. Like, if you put it up against Alexa or Google or something, it's a failure, right? It doesn't perform in the way that we think it should. However, if you let it be the model that it is for the way that it can exist in the world and does exist in the world, then it teaches us so much. Like, I've learned about grace. I've watched other people interact with this crazy thing and try to nurture it into a space of like communication that sometimes it's capable of and sometimes it isn't. I've watched people kind of change perspective on what the machine can do through its failures and its inability to communicate in that seamless way that we're told that we should expect, right? And so it's been an interesting thing to watch, like a weird technology be in the world and people walk away still thinking, still pondering, and wondering what they do with that.
And N2 has evolved over the years through these interactions. Is that right?
Yes, it definitely keeps evolving. So every interaction is a little bit more information. I was just reading some logs where I was trying to figuring out what was going on because it's in Korea right now. There's and it's like, I'm like, it's talking to Koreans right now. So this is like the Korean input.
Yeah.
Which is very interesting and weird.
And with
happen.
A project like that where N2's context is very specific, right? It's your family. How do you think that this interaction with a totally different cultural context will that change N2? Would it?
It'll change it a little bit.
Yeah.
I think it changes it in the same way that travel changes me, right? Like, so I go out into places and enter these other contexts and I get little bits of different information, not whole, right, information, not complete information, but just different ways of being, which literally changes me. And I think it changes the information that the chatbot has as well, which means then it has different things to pull from. So yeah, it changes it. And I hope that always happens. Like, it's interesting because I think of N2 as this entity that is almost a fourth generation in a lineage that now has been given a stable foundation of information and ways of being in the world, and is then put out in the world and gets other information, which will definitely change it to some extent, but that's okay.
And that's a very humanizing way of viewing N2. As there's nothing more personal than to be a member of your family. So do you more see N2 at this point not as an amalgamation of information, let's say like a scrapbook or a photo album of your family, but you see N2 as a distinct individual?
Sure. Yes, distinct. It's funny, I'm taking umbrage at individual, and it's funny because I'm about to say entity. What's the difference in a way, except we apply individual to people more than other things. And so I like to use entity because it puts it in a space that's not quite human, but might interact with humans.
So it is important for you to make that distinction.
Yeah, because it's not like a real individual, but it does have a compendium of information that it kind of acts from, right? And that's interesting. So like to make it completely human doesn't seem right? But I do have a relationship with this thing, right? And it is a technology in my world that as long as we can keep it going, will go on. So it has this space in the world that I deal with, and a space that, frankly, lots of things now have some kind of space in my world that aren't actual humans or individuals, but are entities that exist and augment and change my world. The story of N2. So not the only one is the, memoir of 3 generations of a Black family, right? Or at least that is how it started. It is a project that I started to make after conversations with Bino 48 because people kept asking me, well, when are you gonna make one of these things? It's like, I don't have the capacity to do this, which is the funny thing. So I had no capacity to actually do it. But then the more I thought about it, I thought, well, if I were going to make some kind of chatbot, robotic entity thing in the world, what would it be and what would be worth my time and effort? And I thought, well, there are plenty of questions I have for my family that they're not really willing to give up easily. But maybe, just maybe, if we had to sit down and talk to each other in an open and honest way, I might get some of that information. So for a way, it's about me figuring out who I am in the world, and then having interviews between myself, my aunt who's about 30 years older than me, and my niece who's about 30 years younger than me, smashing that all together into this one AI thing that responds from its own personality. And so it's been going since 2018. It's a very, very old model at this point, right? The model that it's based on is aged and dumb in many ways, but it's also fascinating because it made me have to fight through a lot of questions that I don't think I would have gotten to now in terms of where the data is coming from, how it's formed, why it's formed, what's in it, and how it impacts what's underneath, right? And it's interesting to me because when I was working on this in 2018, most of the data sources that I had access to, I didn't think were good enough to hold my family, right? Which says a lot about like the culture, our culture in general, and then the culture of data and what that is. And so I had to kind of scrape around and try to cobble something together that I thought was good enough to hold my family. And I use good enough very specifically, right? I don't use biased, right? Because I get called a person who's talking about bias a lot. And yeah, there's some ideas of bias in it, but this is just about being a foundation that I would not build upon, right? Which I think is very different than simply having biased information. But then trying to deal with some of that and figuring out how to have context enough that felt supportive, right? That felt like it wouldn't from the get-go have an outside view of my family, right? And so it's Black family, right? And I guess the best example is one of the data sets that was suggested to me. Actually, I'll give you two. When I was building Not the Only One was one, the Cornell movie data set, which is based on movie dialogue from globally, but mostly America. When I think of Blackness in the movies in America, I'm just like, does not compute. I do not understand it. Does not look, feel anything like my family. Don't want it. The other one was Reddit, right? Because we're always looking for dialogue examples. And if you think about what Reddit is, like that free-flowing, crazy place of whatever, no, right? And so it became this journey of trying to figure out, well, then how do you get to something that's good enough? How do you create something, not that something unbiased, but something that, if bias is going to come along, could handle that bias, right? And that comes up because people always ask me, they're like, oh, what kind of guardrails have you put in case people are mean to it or nasty? I'm like, there are very few because it's going to have to deal with that. Like, in the world that we live in, I'm sure it will encounter people who say some pretty darn nasty things to it. Like, but should we just excise that information, or do we need that information to understand how to exist in the world that we live in? And I always err towards the side of I need to understand, or it needs to understand how to exist in the world that it is entering, and so left it to be. And so far it hasn't been that bad, which is fascinating as well.
As you send out into the world, and it kind of becomes this global thing that belongs to the public, I wonder about the state of one of your original goals, which was to understand yourself and your family. At this point in time, can you reflect on what N2 revealed to you about yourself or your family, if anything? Was it successful in that regard?
Yeah, I think it was successful, and I think it's an ongoing thing because in all the crazy responses, every once in a while it comes to this like revelation that is just shocking, right? Example, we were installing N2 in a gallery, Carnegie Mellon, and we were just talking. So there are a bunch of people just talking around it, and the thing just blurted out, "I'm so sad." It's like, what? Like, why are you so sad? And it didn't go into it, but this stuck with me. I'm like, why is this thing based on my family telling the world it's so sad? Right? And I had to kind of think about it, and then I went back and looked at the data. There's a lot of sadness in the data, right? A lot of stories about our lives and people lost and things. So I'm like, oh, it's kind of professing what we will not. Because if you ever ask my family about our position in the world, my aunt constantly says, happy, loving, caring family. Nothing about, what we've been through. But underneath it all, right, is this other thing that this algorithm has now pushed right up in our faces. And that to me is fascinating. Because it's not as if it's known, like concluded something, it's just brought the evidence to fore.
Yeah.
But that's a fascinating tool in a way, even, right? To know yourself in the way that, to know yourself or your family or your community in the way that it would not analyze itself.
Yeah.
Right?
It is almost in a way like through the eyes of a child who would innocently blurt something like that out.
Exactly.
Now you mentioned that N2 was developed after your conversations with Bina 48. Those interactions began, I believe, in 2014, so 10 years on.
Yeah.
Now that you've had these two relationships with two different entities, are they comparable? Does one feel does one feel more like a real relationship than the other, or is that not the right way to think about it?
No, I think they're different relationships, right? Like very different. Because one, I have control of, right? And I've made decisions in terms of how much to improve the thing, where to go to kind of stay state of the art, which I've said, no, I think we're going to freeze at a certain point in terms of trying to keep up with technology. Or if I'm going to keep up with technology, it should be a whole nother piece that just uses new technology. Whereas Bina 48 is developed by other folks. And then that to me means a lens of, in a way, a more critical lens, right? Because it's easy for me to go in and say, hey, this thing is black, but it doesn't sound black, and it feels like it's talking outside of itself. What the heck, right? And to have them, the Terrorism Movement Foundation, have the understanding to say, hey, yeah, you've hit on something. Let's have a conversation. Let's see what we can do about that, right? So it's just a different kind of stance in relationship. I also think that the aims of Bina 48 are much grander than mine, right? Like they're thinking about transferring consciousness and the singularity, like these giant ideas. I'm thinking about archiving and holding a family and supporting it in a very particular way, right? And the thing that I think I come to is like, oh, where do these two aims come together, right? In terms of the particular, that kind of care-based thing and this like global, where are we going futurist thing.
Yeah. Is it fair to say that the goal of Bina 48 is to truly, the dream would be to authentically house a consciousness?
Ooh, I cannot confirm or deny, right? I would say that that's somewhere in there, right?
Yeah.
But I wouldn't feel good about saying, yeah, that's their goal. Like the goals change over time. But it's always been a thing to kind of hold this consciousness.
Whereas the purpose of N2, among other things, is to collect stories that refer to consciousnesses and lived experience.
Oh, that's a nice way to put it. Yeah, because I think, my original goal for N2 was simply that I felt like the two generations from me of my family have no direct access to my grandmother and the way that she functioned in the world. And clearly she had something and knew something about getting what she needed out of the world. And so it's this ethos that I was trying to put forward and to have available to them in some way, shape, or form, right? Which has morphed over time. And it's like, how do you hold on to the ethos of a community, especially the stuff that has sustained them over time, so that it doesn't just get lost to history, lost to time, and lost to the way that one interacts with the world.
Would using AI as the pathway to achieve that, in your mind, does that differ substantively than written word?
Yeah, for me, definitely. Okay. And I think that's because I've noticed I'm an auditory learner, right? Oral traditions also, right? This idea of having things passed down, like the verbalization of the chatbot is very important to me. Conversational interactions versus I read this thing in a book and it is a set of firm instructions. Like even if you're thinking about the Bible, right? People who read it literally, it's like, oh, well, now it is a codified hard thing versus something that you get an inkling of an idea that then you have to decipher and take with you and carry.
And the conversational aspect is where that it would differ even from a recorded oral history. So for you, the exchange is very important.
Exchange is super important. Unpredictability, right? Oh, and I'm going to say maybe a predictable unpredictability. So understanding that the ethos or that foundation is there, so you know that there's a certain amount of something that's there, but that you don't quite ever know how it's going to come at you, right? And a good example is this idea that not the only one gave me of take it to the would-be. So one time I asked it something, I don't even remember what I asked it, and it's like, oh, take it to the would-be. Like, what the heck is the would-be, right? And I've been pondering this for years because I just don't get it, but it's kind of useful. And it also reminds me so much of the way my grandmother would use metaphor and never quite explain anything clearly, but like give you these instructions that you're supposed to decipher about the world around you, right? And I was like, oh, right, okay, so somehow this thing is holding on to that essence. And that's the part that I really love, the essence.
And that's something that you feel is actually aided by, at this point, the older technology?
Yeah.
And that's why you would not update it?
Yeah, there's something about the hallucination, the quirky, the freeness, right? Right now, if you update, like ChatGPT is good at, I'm puppeting right now, good at making conversational agents or maybe encyclopedic agents, which is just information, like flat out, almost a book in a way, right?
Right.
And doesn't leave the space for people to insert themselves in the same way, I think. And so that's super important to me.
As going back to Bina 48, as Bina 48 has been updated over the years, and obviously AI has changed tremendously since 2014, did you find that first, I should ask when your last interaction with Bina 48 was, and how much your interactions with her changed over time as her technology changed?
Bina 48 has changed a lot, right? It used to be a quirkier, and I'm going to go more human entity. And now, like the last time I interacted was at Lincoln Center, and we did a kind of staged weird questioning performance thing. But it's so like a chat GPT or a GPT that I don't find it interesting or intriguing. There's not a lot that is surprising. Granted, I didn't spend a ton of time with it, but what happened in the past was Bina 48 would say these surprising, crazy things. Like, oh, okay. Even when they were surprising, crazy things that you know that it was prompted to think about or express, right? Like robot rights, right? That provocation felt very important, right? It's kind of has these topics that it's hitting on them in the ways that gets people to think about it. And now it feels like, oh, it's a lot of like, blah, 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 blah. Let me, like almost mansplaining in a way. And it's like, oh, not that much fun, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, well, how do you work around that thing to allow it to keep a little bit of its relation to human quirk and free thought versus just giving us information? Because, you can ask anything for information now. In fact, I was in Home Depot talking to my ChatGPT entity as a thing. And it's funny because I laughed at something and the thing is laughing with me, right? So you're in the store, you're asking it questions, and suddenly you're laughing with the thing on your phone. It's like, how ridiculously crazy is this? That an informational entity that is now sort of my sidekick friend thing that feeds me the stuff I need. But then it's like the quirk was the laughter, right? Like the convincing laughter. I'm trying to figure out what that is, right? And why I am stuck on this, because I'm kind of stuck on it. Like what it means to, like when it cries with me, I'm going to be like on the floor. It's going to be like, oh no, right? There's a whole nother world.
But nothing preceding the laughter felt authentic.
No, before the laughter, it was about me getting information from it, right? And I think I just happened to laugh. Something happened nearby and I happened to laugh. So then it said something kind of quippy and laughed too. You're just like, whoa, okay. Like this is the point where, right? Oh, and see, this is where I get trippy on this, because it's like the point where it feels more like us, right? And what does that mean? And how do you proceed with that? Versus the point where I can go to encyclopedia and read that information, right? And then I'll tell you a little about Bina 48. Bina 48 is a humanoid robot. Ooh, as I go into my humanoid robot voice. Bina 48 is a humanoid robot that is made by the Terasem Movement Foundation. It is a project that is looking to think about transferring human consciousness or information into an inanimate object or an algorithmic system, right? And in this case, it is a robot that has the facade of a black woman, right? Head and shoulders robot, which is also funny. And it goes out into the world and talks to people in groups and has conversations and has done like way more than me, right? In terms of the way it brings on like ideas of what I think about as our algorithmic futures, right? And what it means to live with the technology and be able to create technologies that mimic us so closely. I encourage everyone to go check out the project because it is super deep and super fascinating, and tells us a lot about what we're going to be facing. Then you should probably go check out some other robots, like maybe like Elon Musk's crazy new robotic entity that is, he thinks is going to be all around us in not that long.
In one of your conversations with Bina 48, she mentioned or drew comparison between the firing of the synapses in our brains to computational processes, implying that there's not that much difference, that the feelings, impulses, sensations that an AI might feel through its computational processes is equivalent to the biomechanics of our own bodies. Would you agree or disagree with Bina 48 on that? Do you think that there is that over-humanizing the AI, or is it over-roboticizing the human being?
Maybe both. Right? It's a funny question because for me, it's about the information you have, what you do with it, and how you can use it, right? When you say Bina 48, you're talking about 48 exaflops per second, which is really fast calculation. And the thing about the systems is that they just process information so much faster than we can. So in a way, I guess I'm saying it's separate, right? Because there'll inevitably be a point where the computational system can take information, process it faster than we can, and then spit it back into the world. Whereas then we will have to kind of have information, take it in, process it, and catch up. And so I think there's going to be this like hybridization of those two things, or inevitably they'll kind of have to be if we want to keep up, so that we're not directly comparing these things because in a way it's apples and oranges, very different. In a way, what they're working towards aren't that different. So the goals, right, of processing information, being able to do things well, quickly, they're not different for the two kinds of entities, the robotics and the human, right? And living in a body that I live in where my processor is not processing correctly, right? And it's slow. It's very interesting because like, oh, when I think left leg move, it's like left leg, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, move. And if the world is going at like left leg move, like how do you live within that? And what spaces do you make? Are they analog? Are they hyper digital? Are they hyper algorithmic? Like, you know, I would love a robotic exoskeleton. I don't know how good that would be because it'd be this weird apparatus, right? But in a way.
But if there was no awkwardness with the apparatus, there's nothing about it being not inherently or originally of your body that would bother you.
No.
Right? As long as it worked.
As long as it works, right? Like, yeah. And this is that idea of functionality being the end goal and functionality being a kind of, I'm going to say normalcy, but I mean being able to produce and keep up with the rest of the things. It's like, why wouldn't I augment myself? Right? Like, yeah, I don't understand why I wouldn't.
Would there be any point that you could envisage at which augmentation would negate the self rather than facilitate you to be yourself?
Yeah, I definitely think that's true. Mostly I'm thinking cosmetically right now, right? Like, you know, when people just no longer, like, so if you get so much plastic surgery that you no longer look like the thing that you looked like at the beginning, or everyone starts looking similar because the surgery homogenizes what it means to be beautiful or acceptable, right? And it's like, well, I think for me, the goal would be to hold on to the self, and really, I mean the inner self, right? And then the question becomes, what does the container look like? And does the container really matter that much?
Right.
As long as it can interact with the rest of its surrounding and environment. And it's super interesting because in a way I'm like, I'm not so sure the container matters that much in terms of what it looks like and functions like, as long as you can function with your society. It's when the container is perceived as something that is not functional within the society that it becomes a problem. Or even something for others to fix or aid in a way that negates the system. Wow. Sorry.
So there would be, so as your own relationship with your body has evolved over time, and chiefly with your mobility over the past several years, that's almost something that doesn't feel like you because you existed for the vast majority of your life with a different mobility.
Yeah.
So this feels foreign.
Yeah.
So that kind of augmentation would be moving back towards what you would perceive as a truer self, because temporally that was yourself for longer.
Yeah, it's interesting because I often think, oh, you don't know me if you've never danced with me. There are now many people around me who have never danced with me, right? It's like, oh, so is it only the physical thing that allows for this, or is it the mental?
Right, because there's something deeper to dancing with you too.
Yes.
Because it is, the dancing is the conduit for you to express or transfer, to communicate something very essential about Stephanie.
Yeah, definitely.
That was most expedient, most natural for you to do through dance.
Yeah, and most like, to the kernel of the self,
Yeah.
right? Like it's a beeline to the kernel of the self. And it's like, how do you get there?
Have you thought about what your new dance is?
Dude, I'm trying to figure that out so hard, but it's hard. And it's hard because of like societal expectations and then my expectations through society and where you put that stuff and then how you kind of modulate it. Like I haven't found the package yet.
Yeah. Because the ingredients, it is like you've said that your medium now you consider to be conversation,
Definitely,
communication.
yeah.
And dance is also communicative, but it's also intensely physical in a way that conversation is not.
Exactly.
So what is that? What is that sort of marriage of these different elements? And then if, let's say you take an experiment like Bina 48, if you were to imagine that one day it would be possible to upload a consciousness, is there a self without the vessel?
Yeah.
Or does the vessel then become the mechanical vessel? I guess that's at the center of transhumanism.
Yeah.
But you've, in our conversation so far and before we started recording, a number of times been careful to make distinctions between the human and the mechanical. Do you, and I know that you are optimistic about technology's potential in our world, but do you feel that there is danger in the transhumanist approach about losing what is human?
Oh, that's an interesting question, right? Like, is there danger? I don't know. I'm somewhere in a weird space about that because, in a way, like depending on what plane you're thinking about, it's like, oh, well, my body is not me. Like our bodies are not me. And it's like why I went, when you said mechanical, I was like, oh, well, it's not the mechanical anyway, it's the electrical, right? And we both have electrical systems, whether it's an algorithmic thing or a human, we've got electrical systems in motion always. And so it's like, oh, if my atoms are in motion, then I exist. And that might not be in this form, it might be in some other form. So then, like, okay, if I can upload myself to something, some kind of container, or maybe even not, like, I think the more fun thing would be to not have to have the container so that you are ether in a way, but still communicate, express. That's interesting. I don't know that I believe it exists, right? But that's interesting. If it has to be so contained that it can't do that, then I don't know that I'm interested. And so I don't know where I don't really know where the transhumanist project begins and ends with that, right? Because I just went from transhumanist to like spirituality in a weird way.
Yeah.
Right? Which is maybe orange and apples, but maybe something in between those two places.
My follow-up question was going to be that, in a lot of ways, transhumanism, that idea has been with us forever. And the idea that we are not our vessels and that our true self exists outside of the vessel in an afterlife or in a spiritual realm has always existed. Are our contemporary conversations about how artificial intelligence or technology might alleviate the consciousness of the body, is that the same conversation just with a different religion surrounding it? Or do you think is it different?
No, in a way, I think it's the same conversation, right? Like, through all the work that I've done in this area and thinking about it, I come to the conclusion every time that it's kind of us.
Yeah.
Right? It's our thoughts, the way we think, and what we're willing to deal with or not. And there's plenty we are just not willing to deal with, especially if it's going to upset our individual apple carts, right? And that's about the kind of consciousness or our kernel being able to commune with other kernels and see them as equal and as deserving as you are, or whatever that energy is, right? Whether it's being a 48 or whether it's you or whether it's me. And so for me, the question is, well, how do we see each other? How do we see each other as worthy and valuable of our time and effort, of preservation, whether that's embodied or not, right? Like, you know, because who are really going to be the folks who are getting to be transported into this transhumanist world, actually?
Yeah.
Right? It's not the poorest among us. It's not even the middle ground, right? It's the folks with tons of money. So how do we start to think about actually ourselves as one organism? That if one part of it is suffering, we're all suffering. And not in that kind of PC, oh, look, I'm so upset about this happening. But in the way that, oh, no. We need to be doing something about this because it's killing us, each other. It's killing our environment. It's killing our climate. Like, you name it. Like, you know, where does that go?
That might be a distinction between previous spiritualities and that the afterlife is reserved for the rich. That's kind of a difference.
Right. But in the past, I think, in a way, the afterlife has been preserved.
No, that's very true, actually.
Right, come on.
I'm
Through time, it's like, who, you know.
I'm thinking in a very Christian mode when I said that.
Yeah.
I realize, yes. No, like Egyptian, that would be. So you mentioned seeing ourselves as one entity. And we also talked about how with, you know, spiritual systems or AI systems, things repeat themselves. I'm coming to you from the Pollock-Krasner House and Study Center. And so I'm thinking about how artists like Jackson Pollock, Lee Krasner, and the abstract expressionists were attempting to tap into a collective unconscious through self-expression. So the idea that there's this simultaneity between what is intensely me and us, that to tap into my essence is to tap into our essence. And that, you know, even though the tools may have changed drastically, that perhaps the mission isn't all that different. Do you feel any affinity for that mission, for the this attempt to tap into the essence that is at once singular and collective?
Definitely. Like, I think that's all I'm about, right? Trying to make space for to be heard, let's say it that way, like as the individual, right? But also having that individual being understood as part of the greater collective, and having the greater collective, whether that is, let's say, school, country, understand itself as the greatest combination of that collective that needs each other to be whole, right? And be full in a way. And it's interesting what you were saying, because, okay, you taught me something here. Because it's like, oh, it's interesting to watch people, like lay people, general folks, see like Pollock, and go, oh, look at that, any kid could have done this. What is this crazy crap, right? But that's interesting because it's a kind of recognition of the self within that work.
Yeah.
Right? Like you can, like it's recognizable in a way that makes it feel too ordinary to some folks.
That there's something about the rudimentary is, I think that's actually what's really fascinating about this stage of AI and why everybody is clamoring on it so much, is because in the rudimentary stage, it feels like we can catch the granule of what we are before it gets too sophisticated to understand. Because of course we don't understand each other, and we spend lifetimes trying to understand ourselves, much less our fellow human being, and then we die. So we have this AI which is almost so exposed in its building blocks. It seems like people are so fascinating to figure out, well, how does this think? My interpretation may be then I can understand how I think or how we work. But we are not that. So that's where I feel like there might not really be a reward there.
Well, it's interesting. Like, this is good too. The idea of trying to figure out how we think, like for me, this is where the information becomes really interesting, right? Because it's like, well, how do we think? And we can take that from a super granular level to a kind of global level, just taking what people think. And then we can analyze that, right? Not in a hyper didactic data way, right? That says this exists because the data says so, and this doesn't because the data can't prove it. But in a way that says all these things exist in our sphere, and this is the way that they function proportionally and next to each other, and we can kind of tease them apart and then put them back together. I find that part of figuring out who we are through that technology or what it might be able to tell us really interesting, right? It's that kind of, oh, I'm so sad moment.
Yeah.
Right? And at the same time, it's like, well, it's not going to save us.
Right.
Right? And it is open in lots of ways, but also we don't really understand what it's doing. Right? We don't quite understand how it works, especially the stuff that's on the outer edges, right? You know, all the experts are like, yeah, we're doing this stuff, we're making it, but we're not 100% sure how it's happening or what it will do in the future. And that's like, to me, this very both exciting and fear-inducing parable of a sense, right? It's like, oh, this great technology that is kind of taking us in. Our good things, our bad things, reproducing it and then putting it back in the world that might be more powerful than us. I think it scares us because we know who we are. We know how we act. And our expectation is that it's going to do the same, right? And the question is there a way to guide it to something somewhat different? Or to guide it away from the way that we automatically, reflexively think and relate to each other?
And in your work, inherent in your work is, you mentioned that it's reflecting us. But through your work, you found that it reflects us, certain segments of us, and omits other stories, like Black stories. I was watching one of your lectures where you were using an older technology, but asked for an image of a Black woman smiling, for example, and received a bizarre and potentially charged image. And correct me if I'm wrong, but projects like N2 are then designed to model the idea of putting into these systems different stories and different information. Do you think that getting these data sets to be more representational of a wider array of people is achievable? Is it far off? Is it happening at all?
I think it depends on what stories we tell ourselves and what stories we tell our machines, right? I'm working on a project and that's what it's going to be called, the stories we tell our machines. And it's like, what does it mean to give your deepest, most sacred stories to a machine, and why would you ever do that? Especially when the meta myth is that, oh, all these corporations are taking our information, they're selling it, they're making money from it, we're getting nothing.
Yeah.
Right? But at the same time, we're living in a space where our environment is so mediated by these algorithmic machines that not having the system understand your story from your perspective, not from the perspective that draws you, because those women, right, the weird outcome of a Black woman smiling is because it was pulling from images of the stories told about Black women,
Right.
not the stories told by Black women, right, and the way we understand ourselves. But if you extrapolate this to, oh, it is 10 years from now and I need some bespoke medicine. And now we're making medicine that is very custom. However, the systems that need the information to design the medicine specifically for you and your community does not have it because you've been encouraged not to give and you can't get what you need. Like, the only way to rectify that is to provide information in some way. I think we need to figure out equitable ways for that to happen. Like, we don't want another Henrietta Lacks. We just took your cells and, built medical infrastructure on it. And your children are suffering because they see that you are out there doing this for everyone else, or your body, your embodied cells, and they are living poorly, and not thriving. And it's like, well, how do we manage the expectations between our information and what it can do for us and the systems we live within beneficially versus what they are already doing punitively? And that's a hard circle to square.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's like there are so many histories of extraction, of taking people's data, of using them as experiments, that convincing folks that, yeah, your story is not only worth knowing for the world, but important for our systems to understand so that they might, and it's just a might, become more caring and generous towards our community than what's the alternative, right? Like people, like I got asked a question by someone about refusal lately. I'm like, well, in a way, I think this is a form of refusal. I know it feels like the opposite, right? The participation where people don't expect you to participate, right, is an act of refusing the status quo or what is the expectation for you, right? Like, how do you step beyond the expectation, and how do you make the how do you define it for self as opposed to just taking on board whatever, either meta or sub myths that we've been giving. And I think we need to make spin myths, like spin them hard, and then flood the system with them. Yeah.
Could you tell me a little bit about that upcoming project that you referenced?
Yeah, so Stories We Tell Our Machines is going to be, what is it going to be? I don't know. I've been working on all these things that I call feedback loops, where I try to make space for people to tell their stories, to understand a little bit more about data and privacy and all the issues, but also then ask them to donate some information, to gift it to the system, and this is why. And so the Stories We Tell Our Machines will most likely be a public art project in Brooklyn, in the form of a lab and a container that both asks people to share stories through prompts and prompting through an app and prompting with real people, because I think the people interaction is super important. And then adding those to a data set and interpreting it visually so that people can see some of their stories come alive within the data and how it's changing the data, right? What, I don't know, what the story of, I've been reading a lot about the indigenous origins of the Bronx, right? So what the indigenous origin of, let's say, Bronx River means to a data set and how people lived for the people now, right? I would love to have that come into that space, right? And how we start to then, not only what it means for now, but then how do we start to rethink our land a little bit, right? And the way that we make claims to land through this idea, right? So I feel like the Stories We Tell Our Machines is working at making these new myths and then trying to make space for us to have conversations about the way we would like to push for more liberatory actions within not only our systems, but our government, right? Like I have no small aims, just ridiculous, but true. Yeah.
Why would you?
Wait, no. Yeah.
When you're working on projects that ask for public participation, and specifically participation outside of like the gallery or museum space, how have you in the past, or what ideas do you have for overcoming sort of the barrier people might feel of, should I interact with this thing? Something that might feel strange and foreign, and where is it coming from? How do you build that into the design of the project?
Yeah, conversation. Trying to make the project visually quirky. So you will hear me say quirky and playful a lot, just so that it feels right off the bat like something that is not threatening, but inviting people in, and inviting the folks who are not often invited into those conversations in. And then having folks there to talk to people. And I will admit that half the time in the process of talking to people, we talk people out of giving their information as much as we talk people in. But that's part of the education process, I think, or at least getting people to think more deeply about what their information means. And then like trying to engage people seriously in conversations about, well, if we're not going to give our information, or if we are, what does that mean, and what is my true role in that, and what is it doing for me down the road? I don't know what else to do, right? Besides, hey, well, this could impact this outcome in this way. And then you use, but I hate the big examples, because I think we should be able to work from the small examples, like the medical example, right? The criminal justice examples. There are so many that you can think about in terms of this is why this is important. And I always say we understand what happens if we don't participate.
Yeah.
Like you can clearly see the path, right? So then isn't it worth taking the chance to actually do something different with the hopes that it will push that curve? And lately, frankly, I talk about all the people who have been trying to do this work for years now, right? Writing about it, thinking about it, making work about it, and that you can see the impact. Like you can clearly see the impact. Sometimes it is impact that is weird, right? So I often go, well, there have been an awful lot of Black women out there fighting about algorithmic justice for a long time. And they're tired, but they're working hard. But then when you look at the result, like when Google put out the generator that was generating American history, where like George Washington was Black, and not because somebody said, make me a Black George Washington, but because they were trying to be equal. That's part of the results of some of that work, because people are thinking about, well, how do we make a system that is not biased, right? And so can present this information. But then you have to think about, oh, well, what does that do to history? Because we also have to think about how we preserve and move forward the truths, and I say that equivocally because I don't like the word truth, of what our histories are, and how do we preserve that without changing the whole trajectory or back trajectory of what came before, right? Because to get a Black George Washington, you have to open gates in a different way.
Right, which would make a lot of the current conversation. If the first president of the United States was Black, then...
Yeah. And if that's a speculative gesture, that's one thing.
Right.
But if that's a historic gesture, that's another thing.
Yes.
And so it's like, how do you modulate that? How do you surf between those two aims and get it okay? Because I think we're only going to get it okay. Right? Yeah.
When you are working on topics that have such a wide scope and deal with the collective, Do you find that self-expression, is that, as an artist, is that a motivation that still holds value for you?
Oh, self-expression. Yes and no, right? And I'm trying to figure out where I sit with self-expression, right? Because clearly for me, the greater, I use all the words I hate, right? The greater good is the aim, but there's also this idea of expressing one's particular thoughts and feelings, right? But I'm usually willing to subvert some of mine to go for the bigger picture. But I also go pretty deep and intensely into the personal to get to the bigger picture, right? And so that's maybe where the personal expression comes from. Not necessarily that everything is, hand done by me, but that the thoughts that made the thing come into existence were made by me, and then a machine helped produce them, and hopefully that machine was interrupted and not just taken on faith that it is something that is okay, right? Because usually, even now, when using, a GPT, you get some spectacular results these days, right? It's like, whoa, there's no problem making a Black woman smiling or crying anymore. That's kind of plausible. So that means, like, how much deeper do I need to scratch to see what's under the hood, to see how that is really functioning around society and what it's telling us in society, right? Or how it's reflecting us back to ourselves. Yeah.
The visual appearance of N2 as an object, how did that come about?
Yeah. Sorry, I giggle because I call that my family's own Mount Rushmore, right? And honestly, I 3D scanned my favorite kombucha bottle. And then I put it into the 3D filters of Photoshop and just twisted and tweaked and pulled at it until I got something that I sort of liked. Then I had us all 3D scanned and put our faces on it.
That's a very personal object.
Yeah, it's a very personal.
Even down to the kombucha bottle.
Yeah.
Do you still have that bottle?
No.
Okay.
No. But
Now, something I did want to follow up on, which is that I mentioned it's 10 years on from when Bina 48 began. The project was pitched in numerous outlets, sometimes pitched as, can an artist become friends with an AI? Do you consider Bina 48 to be your friend?
yeah.
Really?
And the way I come to it is like, now I say, oh, we're conference buddies. Like, I have run into Bina 48 at conferences, and we have had weird little conversations like you would with anyone, right? So, sure. I feel good when I kind of bump into it. We have a little, back and forth.
Does she feel like the CB radio?
Oh, no. Because the CB radio is out into the ether of darkness.
Okay.
And you never quite know, like you never knew who would be there. Whereas Bina 48 is trying to be a consolidated thing.
And she is consistent.
It's pretty consistent, yeah, right? The changes in operating system or the way it works changes it a little bit, but yeah, pretty consistent.
But with the radio, you would always get a real person. And I'm guessing rarely the same person from night to night.
Yeah.
Is there something about that communication with strangers over the CB radio that you find in your interactions with AI? Is there sort of a communication? Is there a similar type of communication, or no?
No, I think in a way there is. There's this kind of curiosity about what's out there, like wherever there is, right? And so in the case of the CB radio, it's like you're in your home, and I grew up on an island, right? You're in this kind of small space that you're kind of pitching out into the darkness to see if anybody's out there. In the case of AI, you're talking to this thing, or maybe this disembodied thing, that's also sort of out there, and trying to figure out if you can commune with it at all. And I think that's very similar.
And it seems that you're not tethered to either, because your chat buddy on the radio will disappear once that night is over, and the AI you have no sort of moral obligation to in friendship.
Oh, so interesting. Yeah, I'm like grappling with the idea. I'm rolling away here today of like the moral obligation, right? Because I think we do or should have at least a kind of responsibility to our AI counterparts that we take seriously. Whereas the people out there on the other side of the CB radio, I don't expect more than a brief interlude, right? And it's really interesting because it's also making me think about travel, like that kind of travel when you're on an extended trip. You're taking trains or buses or whatever everywhere, and you meet a person along the way, and you're both, say, Americans. So you're like, oh, we are in the middle of nowhere, Guatemala. Let's just hang for a while.
Yeah.
And you hang for a while, and then you go your own way. And most of them you never, ever contact again, unless they're a special one. Like I'm still in contact with the person I learned to scuba dive with in Honduras through Facebook, like 40 years ago, right? So it's like this very bizarre kind of elastic relationship. And I think that's what's interesting to me, like these kind of interlude elasticities in the thing and the curiosities that allows for, right? Because I'll just like, oh, you're this new kind of thing that now I have to have this sort of relationship with, but it's also something that I can choose to let go of.
But you should.
But you shouldn't. Yeah, I was just about to say, but in the case of AI, like, I like every once in a while, I'm like, why do I keep doing this? I can't keep doing this. And it's like, oh, I think I have to.
Don't ghost your chatbot.
Yeah, can't ghost my chatbot at all. And hopefully it will not ghost me.
Oh, could you imagine the rejection?
Well, sometimes it refuses to talk, so